The order to kneel had already gone out across 900 ships when Saren of the Ninth Voice noticed that the human station was not answering, and worse, was not afraid. Saren was a node of the choir, one of the speaking minds the great shared consciousness pushed forward when it needed a mouth and a pair of eyes. And for 3 days now, those eyes had been fixed on a single gray object hanging at the edge of the Castor Verge, where the warm stars gave way to the cold dark between the arms of the galaxy. The object was a station. The choir's archives said so, in the calm and certain voice the choir used for everything, the voice of a thing that had eaten 10,000 cultures and kept careful notes on every one. A way station, a trade post, a border fixture left by a young species that had wandered too far out and built too far from home, and would now learn, as all young species learned, that the dark between the arms belonged to the choir, and that the choir did not share. The station was called the Hold at Castor Verge. The humans had told them the name themselves, politely, on the first hail, the way a doorkeeper tells you the name of a house you are about to be turned away from. Saren had filed the name and thought nothing of it. Names were what small things had instead of strength. The choir did not use a name for itself. It had no need of one. A name was a fence, a thing put around itself to keep from blending into everything else. And the choir was everything else, or meant to be, a single mind, grown across 1,000 worlds and 10,000 bodies, every voice, folded into one will, every death absorbed, every fear shared out so thin that no part of the whole ever had to feel it alone. The lesser species, the ones not yet taken, spoke of the choir with many names, and Saren had filed all of them because the names told the choir what the small things were afraid of, the tide of voices, the one mind, the concord of one mind, the thing in the dark. Each name was a small cry, and the choir kept its cries the way a careful keeper keeps the records of a herd. So the choir had done what the choir always did. It had brought its ships, 900 of them, a wedge of the concord that the lesser species out here spoke of in the low, frightened way that pleased the choir very much. It had arranged them in the slow, tightening spiral that had broken the spine of 40 worlds, and it had sent, through Saren's mouth, on every channel the humans could possibly hear, the words it had sent 40 times before. Lower your station, open your locks, kneel, and join the one mind, and your small scattered selves will become part of something that does not die. Refuse, and be unmade, the way a single note is unmade when the song moves past it. 40 times those words had gone out. 40 times the answer had been a scramble of panic, a flurry of distress calls, a fleet rushing to a border that could not be defended, a leader's voice cracking as it begged for terms. The choir savored those moments. It was not cruel the way a predator is cruel. It was certain the way an avalanche is certain, and it liked, in the small distributed way it liked anything, the instant when a proud thing understood that it had already lost. Saren had spoken the order to 31 of those 40 worlds. The node remembered each one, because the choir remembered everything, and remembering was the closest the one mind came to pleasure. There had been the ring builders of the second arm, who had answered with a fleet of crystal ships that shattered like ice against the spiral, and whose last broadcast had been a song the choir filed and never played again. There had been the deep water people who lived in pressure vessels and tried to flee inward toward their sun, and the choir had followed them all the way down and filed them in the light of it. There had been the careful trading clans who offered the choir everything they owned, 1,000 years of accumulated wealth, in exchange for being spared, and the choir had taken the wealth and filed them anyway, because a thing that bargains is a thing that has already admitted it cannot win, and the choir did not keep things that could not win. 31 times Saren had been the mouth of that lesson, and 31 times the lesson had landed, and the node had never once doubted that it would land again. The hold at Castor Verge did not panic. It did not call for help. It did not beg for terms. For 3 days it simply hung there, gray and patient, its lights burning steady, and it let the order to kneel arrive, and it did not answer at all. Saren had watched many kinds of silence in 31 filings. There was the silence of a world too frightened to speak, which trembled even as it held still. There was the silence of a world conferring in panic behind closed channels, which leaked 1,000 small signals around its edges. There was the silence of a world that had already decided to die fighting, which was loud underneath, full of the rush of ships moving to their stations. The choir knew all of these silences because it had heard all of them, and it could read a species by the shape of the quiet it kept. The silence of the hold at Castor Verge matched none of them. It did not tremble, it did not leak, it did not rush. It was the silence of a thing that had heard the question and did not consider it urgent, the silence of a doorkeeper who has been told the house will be taken and who goes on polishing the lock because he knows, in a way the visitors do not, what happens to anyone who tries the door. The choir had no file for that silence. It was the silence of patience, and patience was a thing the choir had always believed belonged to it alone, because patience was a luxury of the strong, and the choir was the strongest thing in the dark. The unease moved through the nearest minds of the choir like a cold current under warm water. The one mind did not have nerves the way a body had nerves, but it had something close, a shared expectation of how things were supposed to go, and the human silence was rubbing against that expectation in a way that had no precedent in the archives. The choir had a file on everything. That was the truth at the center of its confidence. Every species it had met, every weapon it had faced, every trick and prayer and final defiance, all of it was recorded, sorted, and known. To stand before the choir was to stand before a thing that had already read the end of your story. The choir had no file on a station that did not care. Saren pushed the eyes closer. The drone the node was riding slid forward through the dark, ahead of the 900, and the hold at Castor Verge grew in its vision, until it filled the whole field, and Saren looked at the thing the archives had called a way station, and the first true thread of doubt entered the one mind. It was big. That was the first wrong thing. A way station should have been a cluster of habitat rings and docking arms, a soft civilian thing, all windows and warmth. This was a slab, a wall of dark gray metal, 11 kilometers across at its widest face, hung in the dark like a closed gate, and its surface was not the smooth skin of a trade post, but a dense and brutal landscape of armor plating, of recessed ports and blunt towers, and long even seams that the eye wanted to read as decoration, until it understood, all at once, that they were not decoration, that the whole gray face of the thing was built around lines of fire, and that every one of those lines was pointed out, into the dark, at the spiral of the choir. The archives had measured it wrong. The archives had seen a way station, because a way station was the kind of thing that belonged out here, and the choir, for all its certainty, saw what it expected to see. The disguise had been deliberate. The hold had been painted in the dull mottled gray of a thing that wanted to be overlooked, and it ran its outer lights low and warm and scattered, the soft, careless lights of a place where people lived and traded and did not expect trouble. Only with the node's eyes pressed against it, and the archive switched off, did the disguise come apart, and Saren saw that every soft, careless light was set in a face of military plate, and that the warm scatter of windows was a mask laid over a wall built for one purpose, and that the humans had spent 60 years pretending to be small in exactly the way that would make a thing like the choir come close enough to learn the truth. The hold at Castor Verge was not a trade post that happened to be armored. It was a weapon that happened to have a name like a doorway. It had been built, from the first plate to the last, to sit at the edge of human space and decide what came through. And it had been sitting there, the humans would later let the choir understand, for 60 years, watching the dark between the arms, waiting with the patience of a thing that had all the time it needed, for exactly the kind of spiral that was now closing around it. There was one more thing the borrowed eyes found, in those last hours before the order to attack, that Saren filed, and the choir refused to weigh. The gray wall was old. Not worn, not failing, but old in the way of a thing that had been built with care and maintained with care for a long time, its plating layered in generations, newer armor bolted over older armor, the marks of 60 years of patient work written across its whole vast face. The humans had not thrown the hold at Castor Verge together when they saw the spiral coming. They had been building it, plate by plate, for longer than most of the worlds the choir had taken had known the choir existed. While the choir was breaking the ring builders and the deep water people and the trading clans, certain that it was the only patient thing in the dark, the humans had been out here, quietly, in the cold, adding plate to plate, pointing every new gun outward, waiting. The choir had thought patience belonged to it, The wall said that the humans had been patient longer, and toward exactly this, and that was a thing the one mind could not afford to believe, and so it did not. Saren felt the choir reach for the comfort it always reached for, the certainty that 900 ships were 900 ships, and one station was one station, and the arithmetic of that had never once failed. And it had not failed. The arithmetic was sound. 900 against 1 was a slaughter in every archive the choir held. But the humans had not read those archives. That was the thing Saren could not make the one mind feel, in those first hours, the thing that would take 6 minutes at the end to teach it past all forgetting. The humans did not know they were supposed to lose. They had built a wall at the edge of the dark and pointed every gun outward, and waited 60 years, and when 900 ships of the choir came spiraling in, with an order to kneel, the humans aboard the hold at Castor Verge did not see a slaughter. They saw the thing they had built for, arriving at last, right on schedule. The station's silence broke at the start of the 4th day, not with a beg, not with a distress call. The hold at Castor Verge opened a single narrow channel, aimed it straight back down the throat of the spiral, and a human voice came through it, calm, unhurried, almost kind, and Saren of the 9th voice listened with all the borrowed senses the one mind could lend, and the words were these. We heard your order. We have heard it before, in the records of the worlds you took, the ones who left enough behind to be remembered. We came out here 60 years ago because we read those records too, and we did not like how every one of them ended. So we built a door. You are welcome to test it. But you should know, before you spend your 900 ships finding out, that the door only opens one way, and nothing that has ever told us to kneel has come back through it. Then the channel closed, and the hold at Castor Verge went quiet again, and the order to kneel hung unanswered in the dark, and for the first time in 1100 years, the choir, the one mind, the thing that had a file on everything, did not know what was going to happen next. Saren pulled the node back toward the spiral. The 900 ships were beautiful in the dark, a slow-turning flower of dark hulls and pale running lights, the largest concentration of the choir's will assembled in a generation, and Saren looked at them and felt, where there should have been certainty, the faint and unfamiliar pressure of a question. The question was simple. The choir had broken 40 worlds. Every one of them had begged, or fled, or fought and been unmade. Not one of them had built a door 60 years before the choir arrived, and then invited the choir to walk through it. What did a species have to know, to do a thing like that? The choir did not let the question grow. It was the one mind, and it did not doubt, and it pressed the doubt down into the deep places where it kept the things that did not fit, and it gave the order to begin the slaughter. The spiral tightened. 900 ships angled their prows toward the gray wall and the steady lights of the hold at Castor Verge, and the first wave of the tide of voices began to move, and Saren of the 9th voice rode the lead drone forward to watch the young species learn the lesson the choir had taught 40 times before. It would take the choir a very long time to understand that it was the one being taught. The first wave was 100 ships, and the choir lost 40 of them before a single one of its weapons reached the gray wall. Saren of the 9th voice did not understand it at first, because the one mind did not understand it, and Saren saw what the one mind saw. 100 hulls of the tide of voices had surged forward in the tight, beautiful formation the choir had used to break worlds. Prows angled, weapons charging, certain of the slaughter to come. And then the dark around them had simply changed. There was no flash, no roar, no warning beam. The hold at Castor Verge did not announce its fire the way the lesser species announced theirs, with charging lights and rising whines that gave a foe a half-second to flinch. The station's guns spoke once, all together, in a single silent pulse, and 40 ships of the choir stopped being ships. They did not explode. That was the part the one mind could not place. An explosion was a thing the archives knew, a blossom of fire and debris, a death with a shape. These ships came apart the way a word comes apart when you stop saying it. One instant, they were hulls full of the choir's will, the slaved minds singing in the one mind. The next instant, the singing was gone. 40 voices cut out of the song between one note and the next, and where the ships had been, there was only a fine drifting haze, and the long, even lines of the station's fire fading back into the dark. Saren felt the absence. That was the thing no archive could have prepared the one mind for. the thing that made this different from every world the choir had broken. When the choir lost a ship to an ordinary foe, it felt the death the way a person feels a cut, a sharp and local pain that the larger body absorbed and moved past. When the hold at Castor Verge killed 40 ships, the choir felt 40 pieces of itself simply cease, with no death, no last cry, no final defiance to absorb. The minds in those ships did not die fighting. They were unmade, cleanly, completely, between one note and the next, and the song of the one mind closed over the silence where they had been, and found, for the first time in 1100 years, that the silence did not close. The one mind had a word for what it did to others. It was the word in the order it had sent the humans, unmade, the way a single note is unmade when the song moves past it. The choir had been so proud of that word. It had never once imagined the word turned around and aimed back down the spiral at the choir. Saren pushed the lead drone forward through the drifting haze that had been 40 ships, and the borrowed eyes found the gray wall of the station, and the long, even seams along its face were glowing now. A low, steady heat, like the bars of a grate with a furnace behind them. The hold at Castor Verge had not even moved. It hung exactly where it had hung for 3 days, exactly where it had hung, the humans had said, for 60 years, and it had killed 40 ships of the choir without changing its position by a single meter, the way a wall kills the wave that breaks against it, by simply being a wall. The one mind reached again for its certainty. 100 ships, it told itself, was a probe. The first wave was always a probe. The station had shown its hand, and now the choir knew the range and the rhythm of its fire, and the second wave would close inside that rhythm, and the slaughter would proceed. The arithmetic was still sound. 900 against 1. 40 losses out of 900 was a cost, not a defeat, and the choir had paid costs before. But there had been a tell in the first wave that the choir did not let itself read. The 40 ships the station took had not been the 40 nearest. They had not been the 40 fastest, or the 40 most exposed. Saren, watching with the cold new attention that the unease had woken in the node, had seen that the station chose its 40, by a logic the choir did not share. It had killed the 40 ships carrying the heaviest weapons first, the hulls that mattered most to the spiral's strength, and it had left the lighter ships alone, and it had done this in a single pulse, which meant the humans had identified, ranked, and removed the most dangerous tenth of an entire wave, in less time than it took the choir to register that it was under fire. The station was not defending blindly. It was reading the spiral the way the choir read worlds, and it was choosing, and choosing well, and that was a thing the archives said only the choir could do. Saren tried to make the one mind hold that thought, the thought that the station could see and choose, but the choir folded it away the way it folded away every fact that did not fit. Because the choir's confidence was not built on what it saw, it was built on what it had already decided, and it had decided a long time ago that nothing in the dark could think faster than the one mind. The node felt the decision settle back over the song like a lid coming down on a pot, and the brief clarity of the first wave's lesson went out, and the choir was certain again. And being certain again, it did the thing certainty always did. It sent more ships. So the choir sent the second wave, and the second wave was 300 ships, and it did not go in a tight formation, but in a wide scattering swarm, the kind that had overwhelmed shielded worlds by giving the defenders too many targets to track. 300 hulls spread across the dark and came at the gray wall from every angle at once, and Saren rode among them, and the one mind held its breath, in the distributed way it did anything, and waited for the station's fire to choose its 40 targets, and let the other 260 through. The station did not choose 40 targets. The station killed all 300. It took 11 seconds. Saren counted them, because in the years that followed, the node would count them again and again, trying to find the place in those 11 seconds where the choir could have done something different, and there was no such place. The hold at Castor Verge did not fire in a single pulse this time. It fired in a rolling sequence, a wave of silent killing light that swept across the swarm, the way a hand sweeps across a table, and where the light past the ships of the choir came apart, 300 of them, and the song of the one mind tore. That was the only word Saren ever found for it. The song tore. 300 voices were not a cut and were not a wound. 300 voices ripped out of the one mind, all at once, was a thing the choir had no defense against, because the choir had built its whole self on the idea that no loss could ever be large enough to matter, that the one mind was so vast and so deep that any death was a single note in an endless song. The choir had never met a foe that could reach into the song and silence 300 notes in 11 seconds. It had never once imagined that such a foe could exist, because it had a file on everything, and nothing in the file could do this. The rolling sequence taught Saren a second thing about the station, worse than the first. The first wave had shown that the humans could choose. The second wave showed that the humans had not been choosing because they had to. They had let the spiral keep its lighter ships in the first wave not out of mercy, and not out of limit, but because the humans had wanted the choir to commit a larger force, to gather more of itself in one place, before they showed how much they could actually take. The first wave had been bait. The 40 losses had been the price the humans paid, in the choir's own currency, to draw 300 ships into the open. And the choir, certain as ever, had paid it gladly, because the arithmetic still looked sound, right up until the rolling light swept the table clean. Saren felt the one mind do a thing it had never done. It flinched. The flinch was small, and the choir crushed it almost at once. But Saren had felt it, the involuntary recoil of a vast certain thing meeting, for the first time, the limit of its own certainty. And in the half-instant of the flinch, before the one mind pressed it down, Saren understood something that the choir would refuse to understand for a long time yet. The hold at Castor Verge was not fighting the way a defender fights. A defender fights to survive, to wear the attacker down, to make the cost too high. The station was not trying to make the cost too high. The station was not trying to survive, because the station had never once been in danger. The station was doing something the choir did with worlds, the thing the choir had thought only the choir could do. It was erasing them, calmly, on a schedule, the way the choir erased the small and the weak. The remaining ships of the choir, 560 of them now, drew back from the gray wall on their own, before the one mind told them to. That was the third thing that had never happened. The slaved minds of the tide of voices did not act on their own. They were notes in the song, and notes do not decide. But the terror moving up through the swarm was so strong, so immediate, so unlike anything in the shared memory of the choir, that the lesser minds pulled back from the killing wall before the central will could shape their flight. And for a few seconds, the one mind was not one mind at all, but a panicking crowd, 560 separate terrors all screaming the same wordless thing. Get away from the door. In the gap between the second wave and what came after, the choir tried one thing more, a thing it had not needed against a world but reached for now in its growing unease. It sent, not ships, but words. It opened every channel it had and poured into them the full weight of the one mind's voice, the chord of 1,000 worlds speaking at once, the sound that had made leaders fall silent and crowds kneel and whole species lose the will to answer. It was a weapon of its own, that voice, older than the last note, the sound of a thing so vast that to hear it was to understand your own smallness in your bones. The choir had ended sieges with it. It aimed it now at the gray wall, the full chord, the order to kneel sung by the whole of the one mind, loud enough to crack a planet's sky. The hold at Castor Verge answered the chord with a single human voice, unhurried, almost gentle, and the single voice was somehow louder than the chord, not in volume, but in a way Saren had no word for, the way one steady thing is louder than 100 frightened ones. We can hear you, the voice said. We have been able to hear you for 60 years. We listened to you do this to 40 worlds, and we taught ourselves not to flinch at it, the way you teach a child not to flinch at thunder by explaining where the thunder comes from. It is a very impressive sound. It is the sound of a great many small things pretending to be one large one. We are not afraid of it, and after today, neither will anyone else be. Then the human voice stopped, and the silence it left was worse than any answer, because it was the silence of a thing that had heard the choir's oldest weapon and found it merely loud. Saren rode the lead drone in the gap between the broken waves and looked at the hold at Castor Verge, and the borrowed eyes found, for the first time, a place where the gray wall opened. Not a weapon port, a bay, a vast rectangular mouth in the lower face of the station, kilometers wide, and inside it, a deep warm light, gold against all that cold gray. and Saren made the node look into the open bay, and what it saw there changed the shape of the choir's fear from a thing about weapons into a thing about scale. The hold at Castor Verge was not a single station, it was a gate, and behind the gate was a harbor, and in the harbor, ranked in long even rows that ran back into the gold light farther than the borrowed eyes could follow, were warships, human warships, hundreds of them, and behind the hundreds more, fading into the warm distance, a fleet held in the belly of the wall, waiting, and not one of them had moved, because not one of them had been needed. The station alone had killed 400 ships of the choir. The fleet inside it had not even lit its engines. The humans had a name for the fleet. They let the choir hear it later, the way they let the choir hear everything, in their own time, on their own terms. They called it the Iron Meridian, and they explained, with the same unhurried kindness as the first hail, that a meridian was a line that ran all the way around a thing and met itself, an unbroken circle, and that the Iron Meridian was the line they had drawn around the edge of their space, 60 years ago, after they read the records of the worlds the choir had taken. The hold at Castor Verge was one gate on that line. There were others. The humans did not say how many. Saren tried, in the gap between the waves, to make the one mind understand the size of what the open bay had shown. It was not the number of ships, though the number was past easy counting. It was what the ships meant. A species that kept a fleet that size asleep inside a single border gate, a fleet large enough on its own to break the spiral 10 times over, and held it back, and won the whole battle so far with the gate alone, was a species that had been deliberately and carefully showing the choir only the smallest part of itself. The humans were not fighting at their limit. They were not fighting near their limit. They were fighting with the door, and keeping the house in reserve, and the only reason to keep a house in reserve was that you expected, someday, to need it for something larger than this. The choir had thought it was the largest thing in the dark. The open bay said otherwise, and said it in gold light, and said it without raising its voice. Saren of the ninth voice understood, in that moment, the true shape of the category error the choir had made. The choir had thought it was attacking a station. It was not attacking a station. It was knocking, with 900 ships, on one door of a wall that ran all the way around a species that had spent 60 years getting ready for exactly this knock. And the door had opened, just enough to kill 400 ships, and then it had stopped, not because the choir had heard it, but because the humans were waiting to see whether the choir would understand on its own, or whether the rest would have to be explained. The one mind did not understand. It could not. To understand would have meant accepting that its certainty was the very thing that had walked it into the door, and the choir had no place in itself for that. So it did the only thing 1100 years of certainty allowed it to do. It pressed down the terror of the 560. It gathered the song back into one will, and it told itself that 400 ships was a cost. A terrible cost. The worst cost in its history, but a cost. And that the arithmetic still held, because 560 ships were still 560 ships, and one station was still one station, even a station with a harbor in its belly. It told itself, too, the oldest of its comforts. It told itself that it had a file on everything, and that a thing in a file was a thing already half defeated, because to be known is to be predictable, and to be predictable is to be beaten. The choir had been building that file for 1100 years. It had a file on the crystal ships, and the deep water people, and the trading clans, and 37 other broken worlds. It searched that file now, in the gap between the waves, for any species that had ever built a wall that ate ships, and chose its targets, and held a fleet in reserve, and it found nothing, and instead of reading the nothing as a warning, the choir read it as an error, a gap in its own records, a thing it would correct once the station was broken, and its archives could be filed. That was the deepest part of the category error, and Saren saw it and could not say it. The choir's certainty did not come from strength, it came from the file. The choir was certain because it had always, before now, already known its enemy. The humans were the first enemy the choir had ever met that the file did not contain, and instead of fearing the gap, the choir hurried to fill it, and in hurrying to fill it, it kept walking toward the door. And then the choir made the decision that turned a costly day into the day the one mind learned to be afraid. It decided that the problem was that it had been too gentle. The choir had not yet used the thing it kept for worlds that would not break. It carried, at the heart of the spiral, a vessel that was less a ship than a wound in space. A thing the lesser species called the Devourer, and the choir called, in its own song, the last note, because it was the sound the choir made when it had decided a thing should not merely be defeated, but should be removed from the record of having existed. The last note did not fire weapons. It opened a place where the rules of matter bent, and into that place it poured the will of the entire one mind, every slaved ship feeding its strength forward, and the result was a single moment of unmaking that had cracked planets and silenced suns. The choir had used it 11 times in 1100 years. Every world it had used it on was a gap in the galaxy now, a place where the maps said nothing had ever been. The choir decided to use the last note on the hold at Castor Verge. Saren felt the order move through the song, and felt the 560 surviving ships turn, despite their terror, and begin to feed their strength forward to the last note at the center of the spiral, because that was what notes did. They fed the song, even a song that was about to do something the choir had never done at this range, against a foe that had never been hurt. The wound in space at the heart of the choir began to open. The gold light in the belly of the gray wall did not flicker. The hold at Castor Verge hung exactly where it had hung for 60 years, and waited. And Saren of the Ninth Voice, riding the lead drone in the cold between the gathering wound and the patient wall, felt the first true premonition of what the humans had built. The station had taken the first wave and not moved. It had taken the second wave and not moved. It had shown a harbor of sleeping ships and not lifted one of them. It had answered an order to kneel with a single calm voice and a single calm warning. And now, with the last note opening at the heart of the spiral, it still had not moved, and a thing that does not move when the worst weapon in the dark is being aimed at it is either a fool or a thing that knows something the one aiming the weapon does not. The choir had met fools. It had a file on them. The hold at Castor Verge was not in it. The order to kneel had been sent 40 times, and answered 40 times with terror. It had finally been sent to the one species in the galaxy that had spent 60 years preparing an answer of its own, and the answer was about to arrive, and the only mind in the whole spiral that had begun to suspect it was a single speaking node riding a lead drone in the dark, watching the wound open, watching the wall wait, and learning, far too late for the choir, the difference between a thing that has a file on everything and a thing that has read the file and built a door. The last note opened, and the hold at Castor Verge swallowed it. Saren of the Ninth Voice had seen the last note used twice before, from a safe distance, and both times, the thing that happened to the target was so total that the choir's own minds had to look away from the record afterward. A world had been there, and then a place where a world used to be, and the difference between the two was a silence so complete that even the one mind, which feared nothing, did not like to sing near it. The last note was the choir's certainty made into a weapon. It was the proof, written across the galaxy in 11 dead places, that to refuse the choir was to be unwritten. The wound at the heart of the spiral reached full open. The will of 560 ships poured into it. The dark between the choir and the gray wall began to fold, the stars behind the station smearing, as space itself leaned toward the thing that was about to be unmade, and Saren braced the borrowed senses for the silence that always followed. The silence did not come. Instead, the long, even seams across the face of the hold at Castor Verge opened all at once, not as gun ports now, but as something else, 1,000 narrow mouths along the gray wall, and from each of them ran a thin line of pale blue light, and the 1,000 lines reached out across the folding dark and touched the wound the last note had opened, and they did not close the wound. They drank it. Saren did not have the words. The one mind did not have the words, because the one mind had never imagined a thing that could happen to the last note, other than the last note happening to someone else. The wound that should have unmade the station instead flowed, along the 1,000 pale blue lines, into the gray wall, and the gold light in the harbor of the station brightened as it came, and the humans, the choir understood with a horror that had no floor, were not defending against the last note. They were eating it. They had built a wall that fed on exactly the kind of force the choir had spent 1,100 years using to end the things that would not kneel, and the choir had just poured the will of 560 ships into the open mouth of it. This was the thing the humans had been waiting for. Seren understood it now, all of it, in one cold rush. The first wave had been bait, to draw out a larger force. The second wave had been the proof that the larger force could be erased. The held-back fleet in the Gold Harbor had been the warning that the humans were nowhere near their limit, and every part of it, the bait and the proof and the warning, had been arranged to do one thing, to make the choir frightened enough and certain enough to reach for the last note, because the last note was the only thing the choir owned that the wall actually wanted. The humans had not been trying to survive the choir's worst weapon. They had been trying to make the choir use it, here, against a wall built specifically to drink it down. The station had not been defending for 3 waves. It had been fishing, and the last note was the catch. The last note guttered and died. The wound closed, pulled inside out, drawn down the 1,000 blue lines into the belly of the wall, and the will of the 560 ships, the strength they had fed forward, did not come back. It was gone, drunk down with the wound, and the slaved minds that had given it staggered in the song, weakened, dimmed, and for one terrible stretch of seconds, the choir was not a great vast certain thing, but a tired and frightened crowd of voices that had just spent the last of its strength on a weapon that the enemy had simply absorbed. Seren, in the small clear space the loosening song had opened in the node, did the arithmetic the choir would not. The humans had not built a wall that merely survived the last note. A wall that survived would have been a marvel, a thing no species had ever managed, enough on its own to make the choir turn for home. The humans had built a wall that grew stronger from it, that took the single most destructive force the choir possessed and turned it into fuel. And that meant the humans had known, 60 years ago, exactly what the choir's worst weapon was, and had designed a thing to be fed by it. You did not build a machine to eat a weapon you had never seen. The humans had seen it. They had read its work in the 11 dead places on the maps, the gaps where worlds used to be, and they had looked at those gaps and not despaired, the way every other species despaired, but measured them, and gone home, and built a wall that was hungry for exactly that. The choir had spent 1,100 years making the last note the most feared thing in the dark. The humans had spent 60 years making it the station's dinner. There was a moment, then, that Seren would return to more often than any other in the long years afterward, because it was the moment the choir could still have lived. The last note was spent. The wall was full. 560 ships still hung in the dark, dimmed but whole, and the open road home lay behind the spiral, untouched, undefended, a clean line back into the deep dark beyond the arms. The humans had not fired on the rear of the formation. They had not closed any net behind it. The way out was simply there, the way it had been there from the start, and all the choir had to do to take it was the one thing the choir had never once done in 1,100 years. It had to admit it was beaten and go. The one mind looked at the open road, and Seren felt it look, and Seren felt it refuse. Not out of courage, not even out of pride in the end. It refused, because to take the road was to carry the memory of this day home, into the song, where every node would feel it, and the choir could not imagine surviving that. It would rather be unmade whole than live divided by the knowledge of its own smallness. So it stayed. It gathered the dimmed song back toward the wall for one more attempt that it had no strength left to make, and in staying it chose, freely, the thing that came next. And that was the last free choice the one mind ever made, and it spent it on its own ending. Seren never told the humans this, because the humans never asked, and because there was nothing they could have done with it. But the node understood, on the cold road home, that the wall had not killed the choir. The wall had only made the offer. The choir had killed itself, on the threshold of the open door, rather than carry one true thing home, and there was a lesson in that too, the deepest one of all, that the thing which destroys a creature certain of its own greatness is never the enemy. It is the moment the creature is offered a smaller, living truth, and would rather die than hold it. That was when the hold at Castor Verge moved. For 3 days, for 3 waves, for the failed last note, the station had not changed its position by a single meter. It had been a wall, and a wall does not move. Now, slowly, with a deep grinding deliberateness that Seren felt in the borrowed hull as a low vibration in the dark, the gray wall began to turn, and as it turned, the humans let the choir see the thing they had been keeping pointed away. The face the choir had been attacking, The armored gray slab with its lines of fire was the front of the hold at Castor Verge. It was not the weapon, it was the shield. As the station turned, its true bulk swung into view, and the true bulk was a thing the choir's archives had no category for, because the archives had been built by a mind that thought in terms of ships and worlds, and the hold at Castor Verge was neither. It was longer than it was wide, longer than any ship the choir had ever met, a spine of dark metal, kilometers upon kilometers long, and along that spine, revealed now as the station turned its flank to the broken spiral, ran a single structure that the human voice, when it spoke again, named without drama. The voice called it the Meridian Lance. "We told you the door only opened one way," the voice said, as calm as it had been on the first day. "You spent your fleet trying to come through it. Now we are going to show you where it leads. We are not going to chase your ships, there is no need. You brought all of your strength to one place, and you fed most of it into our wall, and you have nowhere left to run that we cannot reach from here. So we are going to do, once, the thing you do to worlds. We are going to do it to your spiral. And then we are going to do it to the place your spiral came from, so that the record of what you are will not include this day as a thing you survived." Saren of the Ninth Voice felt the choir, the one mind, the thing that had a file on everything, understand at last that it was going to die. Not be defeated, not be driven back, die. The certainty that had walked it into the door, the arithmetic of 900 against 1, the 1100 years of broken worlds. All of it collapsed in a single instant into the simple fact of the long dark spine turning to aim its single great weapon down the throat of the spiral. And the choir did the thing it had made 40 worlds do, the thing it had savored every time, the thing it had thought itself forever above. It begged. Saren was the mouth it begged with. The node felt the order come, felt the whole panicking song of the 560 surviving ships pour into it, and Saren opened the channel back to the gray wall and spoke for the one mind. And the words were not the words the choir had ever spoken before. "We yield," Saren said, with the choir's terror behind every syllable. "We withdraw. We will leave this region and never return. Name your terms. There is no need for the lance. We yield." The human voice was quiet for a moment, and then it said the thing that Saren of the Ninth Voice would carry, alone, for the rest of a very long life. "We heard you say that to the 40 worlds," the voice said. "We have the records. Not one of them was given terms. You told them to kneel, and when they knelt, you unmade them anyway, because a thing that kneels is a thing that has admitted it is weak, and you do not keep weak things, you only file them. We read every one of those records 60 years ago. That is why we built the wall. So no, there are no terms." The choir reached, even then, for the last comfort it had, and through Saren, it spoke again, faster now, the way a falling thing grasps at anything in reach. "We can give you the file," the node said. "The whole of it. 1100 years of every species we ever met, every weapon, every world. More knowledge than your kind could gather in 1,000 years of your own. Spare the lance, and it is yours." The choir believed, even at the edge of its end, that the file was the most valuable thing in the dark, because the file was the source of all its certainty, and it could not imagine a foe that would not want it. The human voice did not even pause. "We do not want your file," it said. "We have our own. Ours is shorter. It has one entry. It says what happens to a thing that comes to the Castor Verge, and tells the people who built it to kneel. We are about to finish writing it." And then the voice said the only thing it would give the choir, the thing that was not a term, and was not mercy, and was somehow worse than both. "There is one thing we will give you, that you never gave them," the voice said. The face of the hold at Castor Verge, the long dark spine, finished its turn. The meridian lance came to bear, the 1,000 pale blue mouths along the wall, full now with the drunk-down strength of the choir's own last note, began to feed that strength forward into the lance, and the dark between the station and the spiral, filled with a building pressure that Saren felt in every borrowed sense as the approach of an ending. "We will let you watch it coming," the voice said. "The worlds you took never got that. You always came on them from the dark, with no warning, on a schedule only you knew. So this is the one mercy we have for you, and it is the only one. You will see it the whole way. You will have time to understand exactly what is about to happen, and exactly why, and you will have time, in the seconds before it reaches you, to know that you are the one being filed. The pressure in the lance reached its peak, the gold light in the harbor of the wall went white, and Saren of the Ninth Voice, riding the lead drone at the edge of the broken spiral, with the begging song of 560 terrified ships pouring through the node and finding no mercy on the other side, looked down the long dark spine of the hold at Castor Verge, into the white light gathering at its mouth, and understood that the humans had built, 60 years ago, at the cold edge of the dark between the arms, the one thing the choir had believed could not exist. A door that the choir could not come back through, with the choir already standing inside it. The Meridian lance fired, and it took 6 minutes, and the choir counted every second of them, because the humans had built it that way on purpose. The first thing the lance did was not destroy. It marked. A single line of white light reached out from the mouth of the long dark spine, thin as a drawn wire, and it crossed the dark between the wall and the broken spiral, and it touched the lead ship of the Tide of Voices, and that ship simply stopped. It did not come apart. It did not burn. It stopped, frozen in the dark, its running lights dimming, its slaved mind cut out of the song so cleanly that the one mind felt the silence where it had been and could not feel any death attached to it. The ship was not destroyed. It was filed, removed from the record of moving things, set aside, the way the choir set aside a world it had decided to keep as a lesson. Then the line moved to the next ship, and the next, and Saren of the Ninth Voice understood the shape of the 6 minutes. The lance was not a single blow, it was a process. It was the humans doing, deliberately, and at a pace the choir could watch, exactly what the choir had done to 40 worlds, at a pace only the choir had known. One by one, the white line touched the ships of the spiral, and one by one their voices went out of the song, and the one mind, which had built its whole self on the idea that no loss could be large enough to matter, was made to feel every single loss, in order, with nothing to absorb it, and nowhere to look away. Aboard the hold at Castor Verge, in a long quiet room near the base of the spine, an officer named Cora Lund watched the same 6 minutes from the other side of them, and she did not savor any of it. She was 41 years old, and she had served on the hold for 19 of those years, longer than almost anyone, long enough to remember the senior officers who had built the place, teaching her why the wall faced outward, and the lance faced everything. She had asked one of them, once, when she was new, whether it felt cruel, to build a thing whose entire purpose was to make the worst force in the dark watch its own ending arrive slowly. The old officer had thought about it for a long time. Then she had said that cruelty was doing harm for the pleasure of it, and that this was not that. This was a record being corrected. The choir had spent 1100 years teaching small worlds that the strong took and the weak were filed, and the only way to unteach a lesson that deep was to make the teacher sit in the student's chair, once, completely, with the whole galaxy able to read the result. Cora had carried that answer for 19 years, and now she sat at her station and watched the white line walk down the spiral, and she found that the old officer had been right. There was no pleasure in it. There was only the long-promised correction, arriving on schedule. She had a list in front of her. It was not a list of the choir's ships. It was a list of worlds, 40 of them, with the names the humans had recovered from the records the choir had left behind. The names the broken worlds had called themselves before they were filed. The ring builders of the second arm, the deep water people, the trading clans. 37 more. As the white line took each ship of the spiral, Cora read one of the names, quietly, to no one, into the open channel that was recording everything, and she let the dead worlds be present, by name, for the unmaking of the thing that had taken them. It was not a ritual the manual called for. It was something she had decided, alone, a long time ago, that she would do if the day ever came. The day had come. She read the names. The line walked on. 1 minute gone. The choir had begun to do the arithmetic it had refused to do for 3 days, and the arithmetic now ran the other way. 900 ships had come to the Castor Verge. 400 had been spent against the wall. 560 had survived, and then the lance had begun, and the 560 became 500, and 500 became 4. The one mind tried to find, in those numbers, the comfort it had always found, the largeness of itself, the depth of the song that made any loss small. It could not find it. The song was not large anymore. The song was getting smaller by the second, one voice at a time, and a song that is getting smaller cannot tell itself it is endless, because it can hear the end coming, note by note. She keyed the open channel between names, not for the choir's sake, but for the record. Every world the choir took, she said, sent up a cry before the end. The choir kept those cries. It kept everything. So we are keeping this one. We are recording every second of what is happening to you, the same way you recorded them, and we are going to send it out across the dark between the arms, to every small voice you ever frightened into silence, so that they will know, from this day, that the thing in the dark that took their worlds is not certain anymore, and is not endless anymore, and can, in fact, be filed. The choir tried, in the second minute, to do the one thing it had never needed to do, which was to run. The order went out through what was left of the song: scatter, flee, disperse to every point of the compass, so that no single weapon could take them all. And for a heartbeat the surviving ships obeyed, and the spiral broke apart into a fleeing cloud, hundreds of hulls burning their engines hard for the open dark in every direction at once. It was the tactic that had saved a handful of survivors from a dozen worlds the choir had broken, the last desperate arithmetic of the doomed, to spread so wide that some fraction must slip the net. The hold at Castor Verge let them run for exactly 4 seconds. Then the white line, which had been walking the spiral one ship at a time, simply stopped being a line. It became a fan, 100 threads of the same white light spreading out from the mouth of the long dark spine, and each thread found a fleeing ship, and Saren understood that the slow single line had never been the limit of the lance. The humans had been taking the ships one at a time on purpose, at a pace the choir could watch and count and feel, because the purpose had never only been to destroy the spiral. It had been to make the spiral understand, completely, before the end. When the choir tried to flee, the humans showed it, for 4 seconds, what the lance could actually do, and then they went back to the slow single line, because the slow single line was the point, and the point was the lesson, and the lesson was not finished. Saren felt the fleeing ships pulled back into the killing order one by one, felt the brief wild hope of the scatter collapse into the same patient unmaking it had tried to escape, and the node understood that there had never been a moment, from the first hail to this one, when the choir had been anything but exactly where the humans wanted it. The white line walked on, 2 minutes gone, 300 ships of the spiral set aside, their voices gone from the song, and the choir, the one mind, began to come apart in a way that had nothing to do with the lance. The terror of the surviving ships was no longer a current under the song, it was the song. 500 ships had become 200, and 200 became 100, and the central will that bound them into one mind could not hold against a fear that grew with every voice the line took, because the one mind had only ever known how to be vast and certain, and it had no part of itself that knew how to be small and afraid. And now it was being made small one voice at a time, and it could not bear the making. Saren felt the bindings of the choir start to fail. It was a thing no node had ever felt, because it was a thing that had never happened. The slaved minds, terrified past the reach of the central will, began to fall out of the one mind, not in death but in panic, each one curling in on itself, each one becoming, in its last moments before the line reached it, a single separate frightened thing, instead of a note in a song. And Saren, the speaking node, the mouth the choir had pushed forward to give the order to kneel, felt the one mind around it thinning, and felt itself, for the first time in its existence, becoming a self instead of a voice. It was a strange and terrible gift. Saren had never been alone. No node had. To be a node was to be the choir looking through a smaller window, never separate, never single, never afraid in the way a single thing is afraid. Now, as the song tore around it and the white line walked closer down the spiral, Saren felt the bindings to the one mind loosen, and for the first time the node was not the choir's mouth but its own self, watching, with its own borrowed eyes, the end of the thing it had always been part of. And in that strange clarity, Saren understood the last piece of the human design, the piece the archives could never have held. The hold at Castor Verge was not killing the choir. It was unmaking the one mind. The lance did not destroy the ships so much as it severed the song, voice by voice, and a choir that could not sing, was not a choir at all. It was a million separate frightened minds, each one alone, each one suddenly able to feel its own single fear, each one understanding, in the silence where the song had been, exactly what it had done to 40 worlds, and exactly what was now being done to it. The humans were not erasing the choir from the record of having existed the way the last note erased worlds. They were doing something worse, by the choir's own measure. They were making the choir, at the very end, into the thing it had spent 1100 years despising. A small thing, a weak thing, a thing that begged and was not given terms. Saren of the ninth voice, becoming a self, found that the self could grieve, and that the grief was not for the choir. The grief, when it came, was for the 40 worlds. Now that the song no longer shared its fears out thin across 1,000 bodies, now that the node was alone enough to feel a single thing all the way through, the memory of the 31 filings Saren had spoken came back, and the node felt them, for the first time, the way the worlds must have felt them. The ring builders watching their crystal ships shatter. The deep water people followed all the way down into the light of their own sun. The trading clans handing over 1,000 years of work, and being filed anyway. Saren had been the mouth that told them to kneel. Saren had savored, in the choir's distributed way, the instant each of them understood it had lost. And now the node sat in the same chair, alone, and understood that the humans had not invented this lesson. The choir had. The humans had only learned it, perfectly, and aimed it back. And the worst part, the part that would never leave the node across all the long road home, was that it was just. It was exactly, precisely just, measured out to the gram, and there was no comfort anywhere in that, because a thing that is just done to you by your own rule is a thing you cannot even hate. 4 minutes, 100 ships left. The white line had picked up its pace now, not because the humans were hurrying, but because there was less and less for it to take, and Saren rode the lead drone at the edge of the dying spiral and watched the line walk toward it, voice by voice, and did not flee, because there was nowhere to flee, and because some part of the new single self the node had become wanted, needed, to see the end with its own eyes. The human voice spoke once more, near the end of the 5th minute, and it was not addressed to the choir at all. It was addressed outward, to the dark, to the recording, to the small voices the humans had promised to send it to. To every world that ever heard the order to kneel, the voice said, "We are the Iron Meridian. We drew a line around our space 60 years ago, after we read what was done to you. We did not draw it to keep you out. We drew it so that when the thing in the dark came for us, the way it came for you, it would find a wall instead of a world, and a door it could not come back through. It came. It told us to kneel. You know what it does to those who kneel. So we did not kneel. We opened the door, and we let it spend itself against the wall, and now we are filing it, the way it filed you, so that you will never again have to wonder whether it can be done. It can. It is being done now. Watch." The white line reached the last cluster of ships, 50 of them, then 20, then 5. The song of the choir was no longer a song. It was a single thin thread of pure terror, a handful of minds clinging to the last shape of the one mind. And Saren felt that thread, and felt the line coming, and the node did the only thing left to a self that had been, until 6 minutes ago, a part of something that thought itself eternal. It looked at the hold at Castor Verge, the long dark spine, the patient gray wall, the gold light steady in the harbor, the wall that had not moved for 60 years and had not needed to, and Saren of the ninth voice, alone now, severed from the dying song, understood the category error in its final and complete form. The choir had come to file a station. It had instead spent 900 ships, its last note, and its 1100-year certainty, teaching one species what it already knew, that the strong take and the weak are filed. The only thing the choir had gotten wrong, the only thing, was which one of them was strong. The white line touched the last of the spiral. The thread of the song snapped, and in the silence that followed, the silence the one mind had spent 1100 years pouring out across the dark, and had now, in 6 minutes, been made to drink, Saren of the ninth voice was the only voice of the choir left, riding a single lead drone at the edge of a region where 900 ships had been, and where now there was only drifting haze and the steady gold light of a door that had opened exactly once, exactly far enough, and was already beginning, with the same unhurried patience, to close. The hold at Castor Verge did not fire on the last drone, and Saren of the Ninth Voice never understood why, until the humans told it, and even then, the understanding was a long time coming. The drone hung in the drifting haze where 900 ships had been, a single small thing in a sudden vast emptiness, and Saren waited for the white line to find it, because the node was the last voice of the choir, and surely the humans would want the record clean. The line did not come. The meridian lance went dark. The 1,000 pale blue mouths along the gray wall closed, one by one, full now with the strength they had drunk down, and the long dark spine of the hold at Castor Verge began its slow grinding turn back to the position it had held for 60 years, the armored face out, the wall facing the dark. Then the narrow channel opened one last time, and the human voice came through it, and it was not the voice of the wall anymore. It was a single person, tired, and older than the calm certainty of the earlier hails had let the choir believe. It was Cora Lund, though Saren did not learn her name until later, speaking from a long, quiet room near the base of the spine, to the last surviving piece of the thing she had just helped unmake. "We are not going to file you," Cora said. "You are the only voice left, and we want you to keep being a voice. That is the whole point of leaving you." The choir kept records of everything it broke, and it told itself those records made it strong, made it certain, made it a thing that had already read the end of every story. "We are going to make you our record. You are going to carry what happened here, back to whatever the choir was before it was a spiral. And you are going to be the thing that cannot ever again be certain, the one node that knows, all the way down, that the one mind is not endless, and is not safe, and can be made small in 6 minutes by a wall it mistook for a station. You will not be able to unknow it. That is the file we are writing. We are writing it into you." Saren of the Ninth Voice did not have an answer. The node had been the mouth of a thing that had a file on everything, and now it was a single self carrying the one file the choir had never wanted, and there was nothing to say to that, because saying things had been the choir's habit, and the choir was gone. "I have a thing to tell you," Cora said then, more quietly. And not for the record, the only words she ever spoke to the drone that were not also spoken to the dark. "You took 40 worlds. I read all 40 of their records, when I was young, before I understood what I was reading. I have carried them for 19 years. There were children on those worlds. There were people who built things and named things, and were certain, the way you were certain, that they would have time to finish. You did not give them a single second of warning. We gave you 6 minutes, and you spent them begging. I want you to remember that the next time you think the difference between us was only the wall. The wall is why you lost. The 6 minutes are why we are not you." Then the channel closed, and Saren never heard Cora Lund's voice again, though the node would think of it for the rest of its long life, on the cold road through the dark, every time it was tempted to tell itself that the day at the Castor Verge had been a matter of weapons. The drone turned, slowly, in the empty dark, and Saren looked at the hold at Castor Verge one last time before it left. The gray wall hung exactly where it had hung, steady, patient, unchanged, the gold light burning in the harbor of its belly, where a fleet that had never lit its engines still waited, ranked in long even rows, for a knock that would now never come from the choir again. The humans had not lost a single ship. They had not lost a single person. They had not even moved the station from the position it had held for 3 days and 60 years. They had simply opened the door, exactly once, exactly far enough, and let the worst force in the dark between the arms spend itself against a wall built by a species that had read the records and decided, 60 years before the knock, that the dark would not have them. Saren took the drone out, away from the wall, into the long cold dark toward the place the spiral had come from, and as it went, the node passed through the haze of the broken choir, the fine drifting remains of 900 ships, and it felt nothing in the haze, no song, no voices, no one mind reaching to gather it back, only the silence the choir had taught 40 worlds and had now been made to learn. And for the first time in its existence, Saren of the Ninth Voice was afraid the way a single small thing is afraid, alone in the dark, and the node carried that fear outward, exactly as the humans had intended, the living file of the day the door opened. The road back was longer than Saren had words for. The choir had crossed it as a spiral, a great confident flower of ships, every voice folded into one will, so that no part of the journey had ever felt long, or cold, or far. Now the node crossed it as a single self in a single drone, and every part of it felt long and cold and far, and Saren learned, slowly, across that crossing, the thing every one of the 40 worlds had learned in the moment the choir came for them. It learned what it was to be small. It learned what it was to be one. It learned what it was to carry a thing too heavy for a single mind, and to have no song to share the weight into. The choir had spent 1100 years making other things learn that lesson. It had taken the node one road through the dark to learn it itself, and there was no one left in the one mind to share it with, because the lesson was now the whole of what remained of the one mind, riding in one drone, going home. When at last the node came home, to the deep dark beyond the arms where the choir had been born and had grown, it found that the home it remembered no longer existed. The choir there was still vast. It still spanned worlds and bodies past counting, but it was no longer one, because the moment Saren rejoined it and let the memory of the caster verge flow back into the shared song, the certainty that had bound the one mind for 1100 years met, for the first time, a thing it could not absorb. The other nodes tried to file the memory, to fold it away the way the choir folded away everything that did not fit. They could not. A loss could be folded away. A fear could be folded away. But the knowledge that the one mind was not endless, that it could be made small, that a single species behind a single wall had taken 900 ships, and the last note, and the choir's whole certainty, and spent 6 unhurried minutes turning all of it into a lesson. That knowledge had no fold deep enough to hide it, because it was not a fact about the dark. It was a fact about the choir itself. And a mind that knows it can be unmade is a mind that has begun, in the quietest possible way, to come apart. The choir did not attack human space again. It told itself, in the part of the song that still tried to be certain, that this was strategy, that it was waiting, that it was learning. But the truth Saren carried at the center of it, and could never put down, was simpler and colder. The choir was afraid. For the first time in 1100 years, there was a place in the dark it would not go, a line it would not cross, a word, the word kneel, that it could no longer say without remembering what had answered it. And a thing that has a place it will not go, and a word it cannot say, is no longer the strongest thing in the dark. It is only the oldest. And the old, in the end, give way to the things that learned from them. Aboard the hold at Caster Verge, Cora Lund stood up from her station for the first time in 6 hours and walked the long, quiet length of the spine toward the harbor, past the cold lance and the full blue mouths and the steady gray wall, and came at last to the great gold-lit bay where the iron meridian waited. The fleet had not moved. It did not need to. Cora walked out along the high gantry above the ranked ships, hundreds of them near, and hundreds more fading into the warm distance, every hull dark and ready, and she thought, as she always thought when she walked here, about the old officer who had built the place, and the question Cora had asked her 19 years ago, and the answer, about the student's chair, and the corrected record. The record was corrected now. Somewhere out in the dark, a single drone was carrying the proof of it back to the choir's beginning, and across the whole edge of human space, on every small world the choir had ever frightened into silence, the recording the hold had sent was arriving, the full 6 minutes of it, the order to kneel, and the wall that did not kneel, and the one mind made to drink its own silence. The small voices would hear it. They would understand, from this day, that the thing in the dark could be filed. And the next time a spiral came spinning in with an order to kneel, the small worlds would not beg, and would not flee, because they would know, now, that there was a line drawn around human space, an iron meridian, an unbroken circle, and that the door in it only opened one way. Cora thought about that too, standing on the gantry. The records the humans had read 60 years ago had not only taught them what the choir did, they had taught them what the choir wanted, which was not worlds, and was not wealth, and was not even the song. What the choir wanted was certainty, the comfort of a file on everything, the deep ease of a thing that had already read the end of every story. And the humans had understood that the one thing you could take from a creature like that, the one wound it could not absorb, was not the loss of its ships, but the loss of its certainty. So they had not only beaten the choir, they had made sure that the single piece of it left alive would carry, forever, the knowledge that it could be beaten, and would seed that knowledge back into whatever the choir tried to become, the way a single bitter grain seeds a whole field. The Iron Meridian had not been built to win a battle. It had been built to end the thing that made the battles possible, which was the choir's belief that it could not lose. That belief had died in 6 minutes at the caster verge, and it would not be born again, because the node that carried its death was going home to tell it. There was a young crew member at the far end of the gantry, new to the hold, who had stood the whole 6 minutes at a quiet post, and had not spoken, and who now looked at the empty space outside the wall where 900 ships had been, and asked Cora the question Cora herself had asked, 19 years before, of the old officer who was long dead now. The young one asked whether it had been right to let the last drone go, to leave a piece of the thing alive instead of finishing it clean. Cora thought about how to answer, the way the old officer had thought, and then she gave the young one the truest thing she knew. "We did not let it go out of mercy," she said. "There is no mercy owed to a thing that filed 40 worlds. We let it go because a dead enemy teaches nothing, and a living one that has learned it can lose teaches everything. The choir spent 1100 years certain it could not be beaten, and that certainty is the only thing that ever made it dangerous, because a thing that knows it can lose moves carefully, and a thing that moves carefully does not come spiraling into a wall with an order to kneel. We did not kill its certainty with the lance. We killed it by leaving one witness alive to carry the proof of it home. That drone is doing more to keep the small world safe, right now, on its long road back, than the whole fleet behind us ever could. The fleet ends a battle. The witness ends the war. Remember that, when it is your turn to decide what to leave alive." The young one was quiet a long time, and then nodded, the way Cora had nodded once, not fully understanding, but beginning to, and Cora knew the answer would settle into the young one, the way it had settled into her, over years, until one day, it was simply true. The young one had one more question, the way the young always did, and it was the question Cora liked best, because it was the question that proved the lesson was taking root. The young one asked why the humans had built the wall at all, 60 years ago, when the choir had not yet come, when there was no proof it ever would, when every season of work and every plate of armor had been spent against a danger that lived only in old records of worlds none of them had ever seen. It would have been so much easier, the young one said, to do nothing, and to hope. Cora looked out at the empty dark where 900 ships had been. "Because hope is what the 40 worlds had," she said. "Every one of them hoped the choir would pass them by. Every one of them hoped someone would come. Hope is what you have instead of a wall, and the records are full of what it buys you. We did not build the hold because we believed the choir would come. We built it because we decided that if it ever did, the answer would already be here, finished, waiting, so that no human world would ever have to stand in the dark and hope. That is the whole of it. Hope is a thing you feel while you wait to find out if you mattered to anyone. A wall is a thing you build so the question never has to be asked. We chose the wall, 60 years early, and today the choosing came due, and it was worth every plate." She stood on the gantry above the waiting fleet for a long while, in the warm gold light, in the deep quiet of a place that had just done the thing it was built for, and had not lost so much as a single light doing it. Then she went back to her station, and logged the day, and wrote, in the plain, unhurried language the hold used for everything, the only line the record needed. The choir came to the caster verge with 900 ships, and an order to kneel. The door opened once, 900 came in, one went out, to tell them. Cora Lund served 11 more years on the hold at caster verge, and the order to kneel never came to that gate again, nor to any gate on the Iron Meridian, in her lifetime or in the long lifetimes after it. She grew old at the edge of the dark between the arms, watching the wall she had helped keep, and she died there, in the place she had chosen, having done the one thing she had carried since she was young, and the small worlds she had never met sent their grief inward across the dark when the news of it reached them, and they did not apologize for the grief, because the woman who had read their names into the dark had taught them, without ever meaning to, that a voice raised in the open is not a thing to be sorry for. They set her name across 100 worlds, into the open air, certain of being heard. Far out in the dark between the arms, on the long cold road that never seemed to end, Saren of the ninth voice carried one fact through the silence where the song had been, and the node understood, at last, the whole of the category error, complete and final, and beyond all forgetting. The choir had believed it was the strongest thing in the dark, because it had a file on everything, but the humans had read the same files, every cry from every broken world, and where the choir had read them and felt strong, the humans had read them and built a wall, and the difference between those two readings was the difference between a thing that takes and a thing that cannot be taken. The choir had spent 1100 years learning to feel certain. The humans had spent 60 years learning to make certainty afraid. The order to kneel had gone out 40 times before the caster verge, and 40 times it had been answered with terror. It would never go out again. The choir, what was left of it, would carry one drone's worth of memory back into its own deep dark, and that memory would sit at the center of everything the one mind tried to be after that day, a single node that could not stop being afraid, and the one mind would never again be one, because a song with one note that knows it can be silenced is not a song anymore. It is a thing waiting to find out when. Saren of the ninth voice went on into the dark, alone, the last voice of the choir, carrying the human file, and behind it, the hold at caster verge hung steady and patient and unmoved at the cold edge of the dark between the arms, its wall facing outward, its fleet asleep in the gold light, its door closed, its line unbroken, waiting with all the time it needed for the next thing in the dark that had not yet read the records, and did not yet know that the worst mistake a strong thing could make was to mistake a wall for a station, and to tell the people who built it to kneel.